Hello and welcome to The Culture, the world's first esoteric festival. This is our channel. Great to see you here, and it's recorded in the Marrakesh studio, so we say in Moroccan, Jajuka, something good come to you.
Hi there, and welcome to episode Sacrifice for King and Country. One aspect of a culture that I looked into happened to me by accident or destiny, convinced me more than anything else that some events tend to have magnetic qualities. You attract that which you seek, true or false. According to the traditional law of British witches, the Nazi invasion of Britain was thwarted by an ancient magic spell raised by a coven working in the New Forest during the summer of 1940. If witch lore is to be believed, the spell has been preserved by English covens through the centuries to be used only when invaders threatened England. Both the Spanish Armada and Napoleon were said to have been victims of the go-away spell, known euphemistically in some circles as the fuck-off spell. Traditional witches in Britain take pride in the belief that their faith may have contributed to the Nazi High Command failing to land on these British shores. Wicca, the witches tell us, changed the course of the war. Conventional historians may not agree with this conclusion, but do tell us that the Nazi plan to invade Britain, known as Operation Sea Lion, would have had a fair chance of success if Hitler had acted upon it. For some peculiar reason, Hitler did not see Operation Sea Lion through to its conclusion. Instead, he made the disastrous decision to move half of his divisions to open up the Eastern Front. My own investigation into the witch's spell cast on the Nazi High Command happened quite by chance. Yet, what sometimes appears on the surface as ordinary mundane stuff might well be destiny at work. Many years later, after dust has settled, I can see that the manner in which these events unfolded was very strange indeed, as if some guiding hand had wanted the truth to be discovered. It crossed my mind more than once that I may have been aided from mysterious quarters. I hardly believe myself that these events have happened in the way that they did, but of course, the listener must decide for themselves. One afternoon in the autumn, I sat huddled in my tiny studio on the floor of a media centre, after finishing a pile of punishing deadlines on all the usual stuff. Although busy, I remember longing to go out for a walk in the autumn sunshine, just to finish with the tedious work, leave all the unanswered messages, emails, log sheets and quotes behind. A sharp knock at the door interrupted my chain of thought. The foyer receptionist usually filtered such unannounced visitors. I wasn't annoyed, but I could do without the visitor. Calling the visitor inside the office, I turned round on my swivel chair and once saw an old acquaintance standing before me, John Belham-Payne. He grinned. His infectious grin was welcomed, and he stepped forward and shook my hand. An imposing figure of some 6 foot and sturdy stature and a benign face, almost an imperceptible Midlands accent, somewhat weakened by years of living in the south and elsewhere. John sat down, and I made a cup of tea. His manner was easy, but I could see that he'd been through some ordeal since I'd last seen him. There were fresh lines etched on his face, yet he exuded an unusual vigour. Finally, after some small talk, he began to tell his tale. Been a long time since I'd seen him. A full 18 months before, I'd shot a video at his home, which is housed at the Centre for Pagan Studies, located deep in the Sussex Weald. The centre rested in the beautiful grounds of a former oast house. John had done well for himself in life. Having initially studied at photographic college, he'd worked variously as a musician, a bar manager on the Italian Riviera, a marketing executive in the music business, and general manager at Dudley Zoo and the castle, as well as being a museum keeper. In this last capacity, he'd been in charge of the famous Clink Museum, a notorious Tudor prison found in South London by the Thames. Having finally married and settled in Sussex, John had laid down an altogether different existence with his wife Julie. Their splendid house set in the secluded lawn gardens now hosted John's dream project, the Centre for Pagan Studies. He had managed to create a very intimate atmosphere, perfect for small, modest events and hand-fasting. The Oast House provided something of a very special place for almost everyone who came along. Some readers might know that John was popular compere of the National Pagan Federation conferences. As he sipped his tea, John explained that he'd been very involved with a local witch called Doreen Valiente. For those not familiar with Wicca, Doreen Valiente is known to many as the mother of modern witchcraft. Doreen is probably the most influential of all modern witches. Her writings, particularly the Book of Shadows, are perhaps the equivalent of a witch's Bible. The Book of Shadows contains much of the knowledge currently being used in Wicca today. John explained to me that Doreen had liked the idea of the educational centre to further paganism and Wiccan study, and had actually agreed to become the patron for the Centre of Pagan Studies. As they began to spend more time together, Doreen and John became good friends. It was then that John announced that Doreen had, in fact, passed away only 10 days before. He admitted that the bereavement had not been unexpected, but was still very sad and uppermost in his mind. A cloud passed over John's face as he spoke of the final days of the Great Witch. It was then John looked directly at me and said, "I made Doreen a very solemn promise before she died, a promise I intend to keep." Perhaps it was a cue for me to ask about the promise, but instead I remained silent. If John wanted to tell me, then he could. Nothing more was said about this. I was concerned for John, but was glad to give him the information he sought that day. A few weeks later, I found myself at the Old Oast, which is in Uckfield. Entering the one-storey building that looked like a rectangular barn, the gloom inside revealed a large room. At the apex of the roof, with girders pointing across and downward, crisscross above our heads. One end of the building, perched high on the brick wall, terracotta head of a horned deity gazed down on us, the god Cernunnos. John fumbled for the light switch, and at last I saw the interior in its completeness. It was a long room, musty with the smell of the witch's incense, dragon's blood resin. In design, the outbuilding resembled the layout of a Saxon longhouse. I could see the attraction of the Centre for Pagan Studies for those engaged in witchcraft. The whole place was imbued with something ancient and permanent. It occurred to me that the world I inhabited was a bit superficial, perhaps only a veneer of what is the true reality. Peering across the large room, I could not fail to see a large iron cauldron, blackened and aged, dominated the entire collection around it. In all, about 15 or so tea chests were scattered around, piles of books and a heap of clothing in one corner. John spoke slowly with gravity, as if announcing something very special and of great importance. He said, "This is the legacy of Doreen Valiente. She left all of her magical artifacts and her will to me. Here in this collection are some of the most important artifacts and documents belonging to the craft." John has always been great as a conversationalist, never at a loss for words, but on this occasion he just stood and looked around as if he couldn't believe what he saw. I noticed the hilt of a huge iron sword sticking out of one of the tea chests, several broomsticks in another, and a crystal ball lying on the floor, next to an ornate, solid copper pentacle about 9 inches in diameter. The entire collection must have taken a large removal van to transport it, for it covered half of the outbuilding's floor space. At one end of the room, just underneath the terracotta horned head, was a table, on top of which, and holding pride of place, was a coconut with legs. The coconut was called a hob, and it was Doreen Valiente's familiar. Doreen had been something of a hoarder, and John said to me, "Every piece of correspondence she has written or received is here. Letters to all the great witches, psychical societies, solitary practitioners, museums, poetry groups. The list is endless. The correspondence she has written or received is here." He shook his head in amazement. "There are over 5,000 books. Some are very rare. She left me her copy of Gerald Gardner's Book of Shadows, along with his personal altar effects. If that isn't enough, Doreen left me her own Book of Shadows, on which all Gardnerian witchcraft rests. It is such an honour." John pulled out the sword and passed it to me. I held it for a few seconds, inspecting its silvery shaft and crescent moon hilt made of copper. It once belonged to a famous witch called John Score. Passing back the heavy weapon, John then handed me a grey crystal ball. Whilst holding on to its interior, I wondered what on earth he would do with it all. Moving away from the outbuilding past the swimming pool, we made our way into the main house. Once inside the Old Oast, we sat by a roaring log fire, and the remainder of the day was spent looking through Doreen's ritual poetry. She replied that she was having difficulty getting some of her poems published. "What type of poems?" he asked. "All sorts," Doreen told him. The Great Witch mentioned that a couple of her poems had been quite popular, such as The Witch's Rune and The Charge of the Goddess. John explained that it was thought that almost a third of the world's witches chanted these particular pieces at every coven meeting. The Witch's Rune poem had in fact become rather like the Lord's Prayer and Christian hymn, something that was commonly used by the religion's followers. Yet few witches knew that Doreen had penned the Witch's Rune. John told me frankly, I nearly fell off the chair at Doreen's, meaning that she had written nearly 100 poems and that it was her wish that they should all be published. Right there and then I swore to Doreen that I would see that the poems would be published, even if I had to print them myself. Given my media background, I knew why John had called me to the old O's that day. Doreen Valiente enjoyed the title Mother of Modern Witchcraft with total justification. As a witch, her career had spanned several decades, and each succeeding period she'd become more and more influential, guiding new generations towards Wicca and inspiring those already practicing. Born in Mitcham, near London, on the 4th of January 1922, she was named Doreen Edith Dominy, daughter of Edith and Harry. Her early years were spent in the West Country, whose accent she retained until her dying years. As a young girl, she began to play a solitary game to amuse herself, running up and down the street, riding a broomstick. Why she did this at such a young age she never knew, but her parents feared she would become a witch, something they found quite disconcerting. Her parents were deeply religious and ardently opposed witchcraft. At the age of 7, the young child had an overwhelmingly mystical experience when she gazed upon the silvery moonlight casting its glow over the trees. In this moment, Doreen saw the world of energies behind the world of forms. It was an insight into the nature of mysticism that never left her, beginning a lifetime quest for all things spiritual. In her teenage years, whilst living in the New Forest in Hampshire, Doreen began to experiment with simple magic. At a tender age of 13, she heard that her mother was being subject to persistent persecution and harassment in her work as a housekeeper. She confided in her daughter that a particularly unpleasant woman had been picking on her. In response, Doreen asked her mother to obtain a lock of hair belonging to the bullying colleague and intimated that she would work a charm to solve the problem once and for all. Whether Mrs. Dominy went along with this out of amusement, desperation or simple curiosity is not actually known, but she did indeed bring back a few strands of hair belonging to her persecutor. Using black-ended pins and a few traditional herbs, Doreen made a figurine of the woman in question and bound the strands of hair around the doll. Then she began to cast a spell to protect her mother from further interference. Shortly afterwards, the woman who was causing so much trouble for Mrs. Dominy was herself harassed by a blackbird. The creature began tapping on the window every time she entered a room and followed her around the house, pecking on the glass. The woman was absolutely terrified as the stalking blackbird continued to pester her for some time. With this, the bullying of her mother abruptly ceased. Doreen's first marriage was to Johannes Valchopoulos, a 32-year-old able seaman serving with the Merchant Navy. The marriage took place in the war on the 31st of January 1941 in South Wales, where the couple were living at the time. Doreen resided in Barry and Johannes in Cardiff. From all accounts, it seems her husband was unable to sign the marriage registry, but it wasn't uncommon at that time for people to be illiterate. Johannes went missing, presumed dead. We're not sure how Doreen coped with this huge loss, but she was not alone. There were countless families losing loved ones every day during World War II. A Spanish man named Casimiro Valiente, a name which would stay with her for the rest of her life. They are married in St. Pancras Registry Office, and now Doreen's name and nationality were amended by virtue of the marriage. She was now a Spanish national. With already so much life experience, tragedy and deeper yearning for a return to the spiritual nature behind everyday reality, it was certain Doreen would cross paths with the mystical once more. In the summer of 1953, Gerald Gardner initiated her into the craft. Here she took her magical name, Ameth, which is Hebrew for truth. Ameth was a good student, loyal to her oaths, and keen to learn all she could about Wicca, but she was also very independent and discerning. One day, after a coven meeting, she approached Gerald Gardner and asked him about the Book of Rites he was using, the Gardnerian Book of Shadows. Gardner had long told his coven that the material in the Book of Shadows had been faithfully copied by hand through the centuries, from man to woman, woman to man. The Book of Shadows, Gardner told everyone, had been passed from witch to witch in secret. He claimed that the material he was presenting was a genuine magical record of the hidden mysteries of witchcraft in the most unadulterated form. Essentially, Gardner was declaring that within the Book of Shadows lay the remnants of the old religion which had managed to reach us through the mist of time directly from the Neolithic period. Doreen confronted Gardner on this very point. She was unhappy to find rites within his Book of Shadows directly copied from the Gnostic Mass, which was penned in 1919 by none other than Aleister Crowley, whom Gardner had known personally. To answer his disgruntled student, Gardner defended himself by saying that he'd received the Book of Shadows in fragmented form and filled it in as best he could. Testily, he told his student Ameth if she could do any better, then she would write her own Book of Shadows. Working through the Gardnerian Book of Shadows, the young witch Ameth gradually replaced all the Crowleyan and Masonic material that Gardner had included with her own verse, the very verse that she later offered John Belham-Payne to publish. Entirely upon her own efforts, Doreen reconstructed the Book of Shadows, mistakenly known today as the Gardnerian Wiccan ceremonies, into a practical, logical and workable system. Energetic Ameth injected rhythm, poetry, soul and feminine atavistic visions into the heart of the rituals. She always maintained that she never replaced the original rites of Wicca. The poems were carefully typed on paper and each one personally signed by Doreen Valiente, most in faded green ink, some in red. John handed me one, called The Charge of the Goddess. I felt as if I was holding a religious relic or sacred text. I felt very honoured to have been the person asked to inspect this treasure trove of Wicca. My fingers tingled slightly when I held this delicate paper and read the opening lines. Listen to the words of the Great Mother, who of old was called Artemis, Astarte, Dione, Melusine, Aphrodite, Caridwen, Dana, Arianot, Ride, and many other names. Wherever ye need anything, once in the month, and better it be when the moon is full, then ye shall assemble in some secret place and adore the spirit of me, who am queen of all witcheries. There ye shall assemble, ye who are fain to learn all sorcery, yet have not won its deepest secrets. To these shall I teach that which is yet unknown. The Charge is a long poem. There are several versions that Doreen wrote in her lifetime, being slight variations of the original above. The final stanzas will stay with me forever, which are essentially the essence of the craft, at least understood by the old school of Wicca that Doreen represented, saying, Let my worship be within the heart that rejoice, for behold, all acts of love and pleasure are my rituals, and therefore let be beauty and strength, power and compassion, honour and humility, mirth and reverence within you. And thou who thinkest to seek me, know that thy seeking shall avail you not, unless you know this mystery, that if that which thou seekest thou findest not within thee, thou wilt never find it without thee. For behold, I have been with thee from the beginning, and I am now that which is attained at the end of desire. Having read the verse, I remembered that the actual words were read at thousands of coven meetings around the world each month. Doreen had typed them out in a small apartment in Kemp Town, Brighton. There was something very powerful about that idea. These words had come to inspire an entire generation to cast off their clothes, to dance in the moonlight, jump astride blazing fires in adoration of an ancient goddess. It's nothing short of incredible. Doreen is, and always will be, the poet of the craft. As mentioned earlier, Gerald Gardner initiated Doreen Valiente into Wicca. An eccentric of the old Victorian era, Gardner was already 68 by the time he carried out this initiation ceremony. With a keen and sincere interest in everything spiritual, he fostered a lifelong search for the mystical, and as a result had joined numerous occult societies, every Masonic lodge and magical order he could, including being made European head of the OTO by Aleister Crowley himself. However, he wrote that his heart lay with Wicca. Part of this attraction may have been due to his passion for naturism. Gardnerian Wiccans almost always practiced their rites sky-clad or naked. Traditional witchcraft as practiced by Gardner demanded that the ceremony of initiation be carried out man to woman or woman to man. There were no same-sex initiations. After the initial application, the candidate had to wait a year and 1 day before initiation could take place. When the time came, the candidate would be brought sky-clad, blindfold, hands lightly bound into the witch's circle, sword held to breast. Various oaths were extracted in honour of joining the coven. After the ceremony, a magic name would be conferred on the new witch, who would be welcomed into the coven, having obtained the first degree of a 3-tier system, similar in many ways to Masonic craft initiations which Gardner was so involved in. As for Gardner's account of his own initiations, he claims to have joined a local Rosicrucians theatre, the Crotona Fellowship, when he settled in Christchurch, Dorset. Here the players performed esoteric plays for the public. Each play had a spiritual theme or lesson. Both players and public were supposed to learn from the performance of each play. Liverpudlian Alex Sullivan, who led the troupe, was responsible for writing the plays based on the teachings of co-masonry, a branch of Freemasonry originally founded by leading theosophists that, contrary to traditional Masonic rites, admitted members of both sexes. Within the small theatre troupe, there were social divisions. Some players looked down on a small group of people involved in the plays because of their ordinary social background. These ordinary folk had to endure many slights because of this snobbery. Gardner felt that they were rather bullied in this group, but they displayed good character traits despite other players' haughtiness and decided to befriend them. As events would later transpire, these ordinary people would later reveal to Gardner, or so he claimed, that they were hereditary witches. Gardner was quickly accepted among them, so the story goes, and was initiated into the old religion, Wicca, by one old Dorothy Clutterbuck. Where his account differs from that of Doreen Valiente is his genuine innocence as to what was involved in the initiation into witchcraft. If one reads Jack Bracelin's account, the chief source regarding his initiation, he was slightly amused by the naive charm of the ceremony until, so he claimed, the word Wicca was uttered, upon which he became electrified. Having studied the history of British witches, he thought that religion had died out many centuries before. To his complete shock, he was right there in the middle of it. In his writings about the craft, Gardner maintained that Wicca was a dying religion when he discovered it, probably practised by as little as 6 or 7 groups nationally. He claimed to have discovered what was essentially the indigenous religion of Britain. According to some accounts, his enthusiasm later led him to publicise the fact that he is a witch, something that was still a crime on the UK statute books. Such publicity was by all accounts said to have been very unwelcome to other members of the New Forest Coven, who began to eschew Gardner as a result. This may explain why his own Book of Shadows was incomplete, perhaps leaving him to make up the gaps with Crowley's verses and Masonic ritual fragments. Several commentators claim to have discredited Gardner's version of events, citing his membership of Aleister Crowley's OTO as the main reason for Gardner's inclusion of thelemic material. Even so, the Gardner Book of Shadows was the first working document of Wicca to reach mass circulation, and it is in this document that we begin to turn back the tide of obscurity on Wicca. Gardner, like a brazen evangelist, took his Wicca rites to the people and began to initiate new witches. Doreen was one of the first waves of Gardner converts, yet it is a fact that Doreen herself was introduced to Gardner by a lady only known as Daffo. The mysterious Daffo was in fact one of the original members of the New Forest Coven, but after 1953 none of them crop up again in the annals of witchcraft. Few concrete facts have emerged about the New Forest Coven, but it is witch lore that they descended from the times of William Rufus, the Norman king who was killed accidentally by an arrow during a hunting accident in the New Forest district. Daffo was said to have claimed that the New Forest Coven had a direct connection with King Rufus, himself a witch. Rufus means red, and as we saw in episode 4, when we talked about Derek Taylor, that there is a connection between the colour red and witchcraft. Rufus was a Norman king, itself suggesting a coven with nearly 1,000-year pedigree. The coven, according to Daffo, survived through the ages to reach the 20th century, where we are told Gardner came into direct contact with the group in 1939. Detractors, critics, meanwhile accused Gardner of inventing the entire episode. 1 or 2 critics dismissed old Dorothy Clutterbuck, Gardner's initiator, as a figment of his imagination, looking upon Doreen Valiente and others as mere gullible dupes who had been taken in by an eccentric old man with a penchant for nudism. When historian Geoffrey Russell wrote in his book, A History of Witchcraft, in 1980, the gauntlet was finally thrown down. Gerald Gardner had invented Old Dorothy to give credence to his fictitious story of Wicca's ancient origins. Doreen Valiente felt sure that this was not the case and set out to prove otherwise. Part of her research involved using a pendulum where she felt that certain records of the New Forest Coven had survived. We should return to that later. Thanks to her diligent research, Doreen proved through birth and death records that old Dorothy Clutterbuck was indeed a real person and had lived in Christchurch, quite near to Gardner. Subsequent research seems to indicate that she was indeed a member of the Esoteric Players Crotona Fellowship, just as Gardner had claimed, yet this is hotly disputed. In his influential book, Triumph of the Moon, celebrated author Ronald Hutton states that there was no link between the actual Dorothy Clutterbuck, a staunch Anglican, and the Crotona Fellowship whatsoever. In conducting her own research, Doreen considers herself to have salvaged Gardner's reputation, and therefore the origins of the craft itself. This is significant because the reputation of the Book of Shadows also hung in the balance on this point. What we must ask ourselves is, did Gardner fabricate the Book of Shadows in order to kickstart his new version of Wicca? Or is it the case that despite his tinkering with the old material, the Book of Shadows is the last documented fragment of the indigenous religion of Britain, tracing its roots back to antiquity? Should the Book of Shadows therefore be regarded as an important religious document? Is it a great discovery in modern anthropology? Because if it is as genuine as Gardner insisted, then it may provide a vital clue to the religion of the Neolithic period. Gardner's disgruntled student Ameth, Doreen Valiente, has supported that the Book of Shadows is in parts composed of modern material as well as older, unknown ritual text. Coming from one as diligent and sincere as Ameth, it is perhaps hard to dismiss these claims. I worked with John Belham-Payne for several months before I came into contact with the Book of Shadows. I'd seen the poetry, the manuscripts, the spells, the artefacts, looked at Hobb, read the entire diary archive of occultist Leslie Roberts, but had neither seen hide nor hair of the Book of Shadows. In January 2000, my business partner and I, along with Simon Williams, a long-time aide-de-camp, were invited to the Centre of Pagan Studies. Sheltering from the wintry day outside, we sat by the reassuring fire in the midst of the oak-panelled lounge. As the hearth shot sparks up the chimney, we sat nearby, mulling over the Valiente collection. John, after listening to our thoughts on various subjects of the archiving, stood up and walked towards a nearby cupboard. Reaching inside, he brought forth a huge leather-bound tome, some 4 inches thick, its dark surface scratched, weathered and old. This was our first encounter with the original Gerald Gardner Book of Shadows. I was the first to be handed the leather-bound tome. Gingerly I held it, looking up upon it with some reverence, perhaps because I felt it to be the last remnants of the old religion. It was possible, at least in my mind, that it had every right to be regarded in the same way as the original Dead Sea Scrolls, Gospels, Bhagavad Gita, Koran or Torah. To my mind, this book could have possibly been a genuine example of sacred writing, a holy book if you will, perhaps even one of the oldest religions to boot, if part of its corpus did indeed originate from the Neolithic period. Our reading was restricted by observance to Wiccan tradition. Because we weren't witches, or initiated into Wicca, we were not permitted to access most of the book, just a couple of chapters. The Book of Shadows kept its secret beyond this point. Observance of witch law demanded that the reader could only access the chapters according to his or her level of initiation. A novice or new initiate could only access what we were reading. The second level, another chapter, and so on, by degree. Because there are 3 degrees of initiation in Wicca, witches themselves were only privy to secrets within the 3-step hierarchy. Anyone wondering what was contained within the Gardner Book of Shadows would find scrawled notes, diagrams, ciphers, arranged in a somewhat spontaneous format, which was no surprise, bearing in mind that the document was intended for personal use, or witches' eyes only. Most of the book was written in green ink. Here and there some red ink could be found. What was clear that the author had obviously studied for years to write his note, at each point adding some new magical knowledge as he discovered it. John explained that there were thought to be up to 7 books of shadows written in Gardner's own hand, 2 of them being in North America, belonging to an entertainment group. He believed that the Doreen collection had the remainder, but at the time he couldn't be sure. John read from the tome, creating a powerful atmosphere that left us all feeling very emotional. At that point it was easy to conceive of the witch lore concept of the hidden company, or witches who have gone before, who return to witness the rites and rituals being performed by the living in this world. One had the perhaps fanciful notion that Doreen might well be in the room, looking over the shoulder, nodding in approval. It was that day that author Philip Heselton, an authority on the New Forest Coven, was chosen to photocopy and help preserve the Gardner Book of Shadows for future generations. Within a week that important work had begun, and Philip Heselton was busy inside the outbuilding, poring over every page of Gardner Books of Shadows, handheld photocopier, feverishly scanning the pages. Philip himself had a shock of frizzy white hair, bushy sideburns, and a massive beard that gave him the outward appearance, at least in the gloom of the Centre of Pagan Studies, of being a younger Gerald Gardner. Interestingly, he had been one of the early pioneers in the 1960s involved in earth energies. founding the Lay Hunter magazine in 1965, an avid wanderer in both northern moors and woodland. He had a great affinity with the Wiccan worship, and therefore the Doreen Valiente collection was the perfect person, really. In a quieter moment, I managed to talk to Philip on my own. We shared our ideas on the New Forest Coven. It's becoming clear to me that everything about the Coven's existence rested on Gardner's account. Nothing about Gardner's story of Wicca went back any further than 1939, the date of his initiation. Was Wicca his own invention? If anything was to be proved, then surely the answer lay in Gardner's connection with the Crotona Fellowship, the esoteric theatre in which Gardner first encountered the secretive New Forest Coven. Philip then told me that he was halfway through writing a book called Wiccan Roots, which was dedicated to researching this link. It was his assertion that the New Forest Coven could be traced with likely results, although it was far more of a detective story for the reader than an article of faith. I agreed to read his manuscript, finishing it within 36 hours. Returning to see him, very much under duress to finish the archiving of the Books of Shadows, we snatched another brief conversation, which I'd told him that I'd read, prior to his own work, a novel by Catherine Kurtz, published in 1983. The Catherine Kurtz novel details the exploits of the New Forest Coven in fictional terms. The story has a hero in the shape of Sir John Graham, a high-ranking officer of the intelligence services who runs a coven. Michael, a junior member of Graham's coven, was also an intelligence officer under Graham's command. He goes missing whilst on a mission in the continent investigating Nazi occultists. A psychic battle ensues between the evil Nazi black magicians and Graham's witch coven. One spicy subplot is that a royal prince becomes embroiled in the occult antics as Graham realises that, in order to fulfil the witchcraft tradition, kings or their substitutes have been sacrificed, or the land, or to protect the kingdom. Is this again a subtle reference to King Rufus being killed by the arrow? Various portents show that Graham and the prince have shared the role of slayer and slain throughout various incarnations, and may have to swap places this time should the need arise. It is said to be literal truth in witch lore, but this had to be repeated in fictional format to protect those who had sworn an oath of secrecy in the craft. Heselton believed that this was the only way people like Doreen Valiente could speak about those dark deeds during the war. Witches take their oaths very seriously, as do military men, the latter who abide by Official Secrets Act. My own mind wandered who the royal connection might be. Catherine Kurtz gives thanks to Doreen Valiente inside the acknowledgements in her book. The story of the New Forest Coven. Winston Churchill once said, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." He referred to the Battle of Britain, where Spitfire pilots banished the Luftwaffe from the skies. According to witch lore, the quote is a subtle thank you for the witches and occultists who played a significant role in the summer of 1940, especially the New Forest Coven. It is said that the witches attempted to have a twofold effect on the situation, one mental, the other physical, most probably by manipulating weather conditions. It is interesting that the 79 rain-free days accompanied the building of the Rosicrucian Garden Theatre, where Gardner claimed to have first encountered the New Forest Coven. Gardner says in his own writings that the witches of old were surprised by the Spanish Armada and had no chance to affect the minds of the invading commanders, so they sent out a thought wave instead. Go on, go on, go on, you cannot land, you cannot land. History records that the Armada was wrecked by storms. Sir Francis Drake, whose name is synonymous with the defeat of the Armada, is linked with an interesting legend that has overtones of the witch cult. Drake requested that at his death his drum be taken to his home in Buckland Abbey. He stated that should England ever be in danger, his drum was to be beaten, so he would wake up and use his magic powers in order to save the country. Witch lore accepts that Drake was one of the craft. In 1803, during the Napoleonic era, invasion loomed large once more. Bonaparte had assembled a large fleet and he planned to land some 150,000 men on England's shores. Like Hitler, his plan seemed fairly sound until it came to the actual implementation, when his fleet, beset by bad weather conditions, failed to keep within the proposed time frame of the invasion. Napoleon then decided to attack the east, and everyone knows that the French incursion into Russia was a humiliating fiasco. Druid and witch lore sources both agree that the Napoleonic invasion was thwarted by spells to change the weather worked by English witches, using the same methods that they had used before against the Spanish Armada. To set the scene, in England 1940, things were looking very desperate indeed. The evacuation of thousands of British troops from Dunkirk, rather ingloriously, had been nothing short of a miracle, but the operation served as a wake-up call to British forces. It illustrated how ill-prepared they really were in the face of the German military might. A little over 2 weeks later, France fell to the Nazi forces, the deadly blitzkrieg overrunning any opposition. France capitulated, leaving England alone. The simple truth was the British Isles were completely ill-equipped to deal with a massive invasion. Nearly all military historians agree on this point. Hitler's Operation Sealine was a very dangerous plan, and would nonetheless have, if it had been implemented, succeeded. It was only 9 months since war had been declared, and the Nazi menace stood only 30 or more miles away from the British mainland, separated by a small piece of water. People must have felt that England would soon be the next battleground. If the witches were going to act in these circumstances, then it would have to be quick, as Hitler's forces would soon be crossing the English Channel. Philip Heselton writes about the witches' preparations at this time. As July progressed, without sight of the invasion, it became clear that Lammas would be the obvious time to perform a ritual of a more elaborate nature. Astrologically, it was highly significant time because it was within a week of the exact Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, something which only happens every 20 years and which is a balance point in the mundane cycle when things can be both started and finished. That is, occurred very close to a sensitive point on Hitler's own chart. His Venus-Mars conjunction could only help efforts which were being directed towards his decision-making abilities and preferences for action. Lammas, the old pagan harvest festival, falls on July the 31st, as we've said before in previous episodes that we covered. Some traditions make it August the 1st. Although this date may have been chosen as the culmination of the ritual, however, preparations would have started weeks before. Several commentators give us some clues about the ritual's beginning. Louis Wilkinson gives the date as May 1940. Jack Bracelin vaguely suggests that the time might have been 22nd of June, while Patricia Crowther suggests Lammas Eve. Valiente gives a more accurate picture by saying that there were probably a series of rituals, the climax being the Lammas Rite. If this is the case, then I would think that the rituals would have begun on the 21st of June, the summer solstice, as the invasion fever began to rise in pitch. Remember, France fell the next day. Returning to the date suggested by Wilkinson, he also states that the rituals were conducted when the Nazi invasion was felt to be imminent. Again, it suggests the 21st of June 1940, when France was about to fall. If this is so, Gerald Gardner tells us that the rites were performed on 4 occasions in all. As a rough timescale, we're looking at somewhere between 6 or 8 weeks before Lammas. Doreen Valiente mentions that the spells were worked on the full moon, but I feel one should be cautious about this claim, as the waning moon is more traditionally associated with darker rites. Lammas Eve 1940 saw the moon in its last waning phase. Could this rite be darker? Above all commentators, Gardner, Valiente, Wilkinson, Crowther, even Catherine Kurtz in her novel Lammas Night, have hinted or even stated that someone died as a result of the rituals aimed against Hitler. Generally, we are led to believe that this death was a voluntary sacrifice necessary to raise the cone of power, traditionally recognised as the force generated by rituals that are sent off into the universe whilst at its peak. Gardner tells us that the volunteer left off his grease covering naked witches apply to their bodies while they're dancing through the night. The action prompted the onset of hypothermia and so therefore death. At its peak, the spell began to project into the mind of Hitler, go away, cannot come." This last quote was attributed to the witch spy Cecil Williamson, the MI6 officer who investigated the Nazi links with the occult just prior to the war. Williamson maintained this account throughout the rest of his life. From these early reports about the secretive band of witches now spanning half a century, the idea that these people may have influenced Adolf Hitler in his decisions regarding the war has always seemed ludicrous. Pieces of this detective jigsaw puzzle were tantalisingly near. Craft owes a great deal to the research of Philip Heselton and John Belham-Payne in their endeavours. Heselton has managed to identify most of the Crotona Fellowship members, where they lived, and what they did for a living. Despite claims to the contrary, it was common knowledge that both old Dorothy Clutterbuck and George Alexander Sullivan, or Matthews, were members, but Heselton went on to list others who were suspected of being involved. Here are their names: Veronica Keane, Peter Caddy, founder of Findhorn, Cyril and Elizabeth Barnes, Elizabeth and Catherine Oldmeadow, is a writer on folklore medicine, Walter Forder, Edith Woodford Grimes, who was later outed as Daffo, Susie Mason, Rosetta Mason, and Ernie Mason. These last names bearing the name Mason are of very special interest to the work of Philip Heselton. In Wiccan Roots he tells us that the Mason family were once residents of Southampton, but came to Christchurch with the creation of the Rosicrucian Theatre and were regular players in the Crotona Fellowship. Sadly, by 2000, when I met Heselton, all the parties had been dead for decades. The last to expire was Susie Mason in late 1979, only 4 weeks after her brother had himself passed on. Heselton informed me that a man named Bill Wakefield acted as an assistant lens grinder to Ernie Mason in his workshop and was still resident in Southampton. For some reason, Heselton named the street Wakefield lived in, and almost immediately my memory went back to some of the notes Doreen had made in her search for old Dorothy Clutterbuck. By using a pendulum, Doreen had located the last surviving documents pertaining to the New Forest Coven within 3 streets in Southampton. Doreen had drawn a ring around these streets on a map. Bill Wakefield's home was in one of these streets that had been marked. I was quite startled by this, but thought better of declaring it until I checked again. Philip Heselton continued that Bill Wakefield had a lot to say about old Ernie Mason's esoteric interest. Heselton urged that I contact him. Within a week I found myself sipping a cup of tea opposite Bill Wakefield, a 60-year-old astronomer and former air steward, at his terraced home in Southampton. I remembered the ringed area on Doreen Valiente's map. I was sitting right there in the middle of the area at that very moment. Bill explained that he'd been suffering from increasingly faltering memory and apologised for this in advance, as he found it very frustrating. For a little while he spoke about telescope. He had built telescopes for RAF museums, showing me various photos of his visits to NASA and numerous astronomy seminars. Perhaps he wanted to relax me before delivering some rather unusual news. He said, "Old Ernie said you would come." Bill looked straight at me and he smiled. A friendly, sincere, knowing smile continued. "He told me you would come to preserve the teachings. Old Ernie knew people would want to know about what he taught, and he said it was important. You must take the Crotona Fellowship papers." I was embarrassed and confused. Almost as a knee-jerk reaction, I refused the papers and told Bill that Philip Heselton, who'd introduced us, must take the Crotona Fellowship papers instead. Maureen Wakefield, who'd been busy in the adjoining kitchen, put her head through the hatch and chipped in. "I said I would burn the papers in 2 weeks' time. We're having a bit of a clear-out. You must take them, or they will be burnt. It was predicted you would come," she said adamantly. "One must understand that these good people were not in any way connected with witchcraft, the occult, spiritualism, or any associated teachings. Bill was simply an air steward, or ex-air steward, and his wife was a mother and keeper of the house. That was it. Neither of them had any knowledge of the New Forest Coven, Gerald Gardner, or Wicca." Bill laughed gently and said, "All these years have gone by, and now you are here. Old Ernie was always right." I was generally touched by the moment, but determined not to accept these papers as they had nothing to do with me and they didn't belong to me. Bill said, "Old Ernie described you all right. I will get them all out another time, but I will deliver them safely to your keeping. Old Ernie said you would come." Bill began reminiscing, as if we'd dissolved softly to another time and place, and for me, old Ernie came alive once more. Back in the 1950s, Bill and his brother Colin worked at old Ernie's workshop, learning how to make telescope lenses. The teacher was a highly eccentric bachelor, steeped in all subjects esoteric. His background was in photography, and Bill suggested that he may have even had a hand in creating the famous forgeries, Cottingley Fairies. The old telescope maker was once a fellow of the Royal Astronomical Society. He'd worked with silver salts for so long that his feet had actually gone silver. When he went to the hospital, people marvelled at them. Bill spoke highly of old Ernie and described him as one of the most learned men he'd ever encountered, holding a breadth and depth of knowledge few men could match. His interests included science, astronomy, biology, chemistry, medicine, chess, ciphers and codes. But in each he knew so much more than even the experts. Bill Wakefield, who had built 3 of the largest telescopes in England, had learnt virtually all he knew from old Ernie. Bill passed on to life in the workshop, where he and his brother Colin would listen in wonder to their teacher. Here Bill struggled to retrieve the memories of yesteryear. He said, "It was all so long ago now, but old Ernie would reveal some of the teachings if he thought you were interested and sincere." Bill continued slowly, "I asked one day whether he believed in the existence of God, and it all started from there." Speaking in the manner in which he was taught by the elderly teacher, said, "Nothing was written down, and you weren't shown anything new until you'd mastered the first exercise shown." I was intrigued by this comment, and asked Bill if the elderly telescope maker had ever mentioned what his teachers were. He always told me that Alex Sullivan from the Crotona Fellowship was a true maker, but the entire Mason family were mind control people. They were witches. It was the first time witchcraft had been mentioned, and when I pressed Bill, he said that he meant that the Masons were people with extra sensory powers and perceptions. Bill related that old Ernie possessed telepathic ability. He also had the power to make objects materialize, what are known as apport, demonstrating this on one famous occasion in front of witnesses. Apparently a small group of people had been talking to old Ernie in a room in his house when 5 stones appeared on the table. Old Ernie continued without commenting, but someone who picked the stones up found them very warm to the touch. It's clear, talking to Bill, that old Ernie had demonstrated similar feats to the Wakefield brothers. Bill told me that old Ernie was visited by lots of people, business people, rich folk, academics, and one I remember used to come in a chauffeur-driven car. It was a Rolls-Royce with a crest on the side. When these people came, it was very hush-hush. Old Ernie just escorted them in through the workshop up into his chamber. We used to hear chanting sometimes coming from the room, but we never asked questions. This comment seized my imagination. I recalled the fictional novel of Catherine Kurtz and the royal connection. It occurred to me that perhaps that was it. I asked Bill to enlarge on his last statement. He said to me, "The Rolls-Royce was dark, black, I think, came from the naval dockyards in Portsmouth, and the guest was very important. He was the most important visitor, I think. The car was always driven by a woman who also visited old Ernie. It was very hush-hush." Turning home, I began to reread Catherine Kurtz and search through my notes taken during my research of the Doreen Valiente collection. It was at this time that I had become friendly with the retired witch after being given her phone number by a mutual contact. Eleanor Ray Bone was an English witch who was instrumental in the revival of modern witchcraft. Carried a rather dramatic title of Matriarch of British Witchcraft. Aged 89, she was one of the last witches in Britain to have direct links with the New Forest Coven. Eleanor very rarely made contact with the outside world or the witchcraft community. She'd become involved in the craft during the Second World War. Having been drafted to Cumbria in the north of England, she'd become friendly with an older couple who lived in the area. On one occasion, conversation fell to reincarnation, and Eleanor said she believed in it, upon which the couple revealed to her that they were hereditary witches. Then they initiated Eleanor into the Cumbrian tradition in 1941, and she practiced with them for 4 years before returning to London at the end of the Second World War. Later she was introduced to Gerald Gardner, and the two became friends. Eleanor went on to become a priestess at one of Gardner's covens. Her connections in the magical mystical world included the mysterious Daffo of the New Forest Coven, whom she knew, Jack Bracelin, who wrote about the spell, Patricia Crowther, Doreen Valiente, and also Sufi teacher Idris Shah, of whom she was particularly fond. Eleanor had an amusing story about Gerald Gardner, who borrowed Idris Shah's red Sufi robes for use in a Wiccan ceremony. Eleanor, of all the pagans I have ever had the pleasure to know or meet, was the liveliest, wittiest, and most engaging mind of the entire witchcraft scene, even at 89. Having made this contact, I realised that Eleanor was the original link to the New Forest Coven via her personal friendship with Daffo. True to her oaths, Eleanor stoutly refused to reveal the name of Daffo, but did reveal her friend had a double-barrelled name and was an elocution teacher. Heselton names Daffo as Edith Woodford Grimes, who he confirmed was indeed an elocution teacher. Eleanor also confided that her own mother had known Daffo's mother in the New Forest through educational circles. The plot was certainly thickening. I asked about Daffo, and Eleanor made no secret of her close friendship with her, saying that she had visited Daffo at her home, and the two had discussed Wicca. Eleanor had discussed on many occasions the nature of the Cumbrian tradition, and her friend Daffo had revealed several of the unknown secrets of the New Forest Coven. Working on an entirely separate line of inquiry, I asked Eleanor about any royal connection to the spells used against Hitler. She theorised that the characters in Lammas Night sounded rather like occultists. Dolores North, aka Madeleine Montalban, a psychic and astrologer who studied under Crowley. You may remember that Crowley and Gardner were connected too, through their membership of the OTO. It's worth noting that it was a witch, Arnold Crowther, who introduced Gardner and Crowley. Eleanor added that Dolores North, or Madame Montalban, was also in contact with Gardner. Dolores North had typed Gardner's novel after the war called High Magic's Aid, which was published in 1949 under his OTO magical name, Skya. I was quite grateful for this information. Alone, the elderly lady continued unabated. Dolores North, Madeleine Montalban, was at one time the personal psychic of Louis Lord Mountbatten, the uncle of Prince Charles. Whether she chauffeured Mountbatten in a dark Rolls-Royce marked with the crest, Eleanor did not know. Her description did seem to fit so well with both the Catherine Kurtz fictional novel, based on real events fed by Doreen Valiente, and the personal recollections of Bill Wakefield. Gradually, the jigsaw was coming together. I later discovered that Dolores North had served in the Women's Royal Naval Service. She also had strong ties with the Hampshire area, where the New Forest lies. North enjoyed a family connection with Mountbatten. Her husband, Commander Bill North, was Mountbatten's agent at Broadlands, a stately home immediately south of Romsey. It is said that Dolores North's role within the Wrens was a cover, so she could operate as a discreet personal psychic to her royal patron, Mountbatten, who also served in the Royal Navy during the war. North was undoubtedly an occultist. She'd founded the magical temple Order of the Morning Star and enjoyed many occult contacts with close connections to Gardner. But whether Mountbatten was also involved, one can only surmise. Looking at the vast web of connections here, Dorothy Clutterbuck, Old Ernie and the Mason family, Dafoe, Gardner, Dolores North, etc., my own suspicions suggest that Ian Fleming and Maxwell Knight, who were both students of Crowley, might also be involved. I do not think it is too far-fetched to suppose that they really had met with Dolores North at some stage. They were, after all, students of Crowley, and deeply enmeshed in the small occult circles of British wartime high command. No one has managed to link Knight and Fleming directly with the spell, but they are, in my opinion, likely candidates to have involvement at some level. During the war, Fleming served in West Sussex, not too far away from the New Forest region. 2 weeks later, I visited Bill Wakefield once again, armed with the video camera lights and a trusty helper in the form of Simon Williams. I filmed all Bill could remember about old Ernie. It's very difficult, as bright lights necessary for filming were not to the astronomer's liking, who refused to use them. Finally the tape rolled and the interview began. This is what Bill Wakefield said. Old Ernie met people in a room above his workshop. Old Ernie was visited by many people from far and wide, business people, academics, well-to-do folk. People would come through the workshop, go to the room. There was a statue of the Buddha placed at one end. It was a psychic battery filled with prayer power. When the meetings were convened, I often heard chanting. All the Masons were mind control people, but old Ernie was the most knowledgeable. He preserved the teachings. When I asked what teachings old Ernie preserved, Bill quoted his former employer. I am the guardian of the ancient oral tradition of this land. Such a quote was pregnant with more clues to the obvious affiliation with the witch cult. It was breathtaking, in my mind, that old Ernie Mason had other things to teach apart from Rosicrucianism of the Crotona Fellowship. In short, I formed the suspicion that old Ernie was the real leader and high priest of the New Forest coven. Old Ernie and the Mason family were the witches' coven Gardner had encountered in 1939. Bill Wakefield continued his interview. He said, Old Ernie could change the weather. He knew how to affect the weather with his mind. I saw him do it. I have a picture of old Ernie dressed in his red ceremonial robes. He gave up the rituals in later life as he found them too strenuous. He passed the teaching on to a woman. It had to be a woman, and she in turn would have to find a man. Bill showed me an old black and white photograph featuring a thin, gaunt, bespectacled man dressed in robes. The garment was said to be red in colour. I remembered Eleanor Bone recounting her tale about Gardner. Had he been trying to emulate the true master of Wicca by wearing red robes himself? Traditional Wiccan initiations were supposed to be conferred from man to woman, then woman to man, in a transmission between the sexes. I could see it in my mind's eye, a desperate gardener trying to get more information from the wily old Ernie, who refused to teach more until the first lesson was mastered. I saw too the reason why Doreen had stepped in to fill the void, on the advice of Daffo, who was the only New Forest coven member who kept contact with the Gardener Circle. But ultimately, who did old Ernie pass the knowledge on to? It had to be a woman. Bill Wakefield continued. It wasn't knowledge he passed on, it was power, an energy that had to be passed man to woman, woman to man. Bill Wakefield went through the minutiae of old Ernie's life, where he could remember fragments of conversations, anecdotes and exercises. Towards the end of the conversation, Bill brightened, as he was able to recall old Ernie mentioned the spell used against Hitler. I was astonished and listened carefully. Bill told me that 2 people had died as a result of working the spell. The accompanying forces raised by their voluntary deaths were superior to the black magic used by the Nazis. Bill told me that the Nazis used the deaths of others to raise power. The English witches, Bill said, would rather give their own lives to raise the power necessary for the magical attack on Hitler. It was, they maintained, much more powerful than anything their Nazi opponents could muster. Eleanor Bone told me and stated that Rufus had agreed to give up his own life in the same way. Daffo told her that this was the root of the New Forest Coven's secret, self-sacrifice on all levels. Bill continued that the invasion spell had been passed down through a certain family in the Hampshire district. Old Ernie had memorised that spell. Bill Wakefield remembered no more. Grateful for his time, Simon and I left after a hearty lunch, clutching the plays of the Crotona Fellowship, plus the private will of old Ernie. Sifting through Doreen's archive once more, I came across an enigmatic piece of faded paper stapled to a piece of a map, along with some scribbled notes. I had no idea what it was all about, but intuition told me to read on carefully. The map was of Hagley Wood. The notes claimed that a ritual dagger had been buried there under a tree during the war years. Some notes were missing, as if this time the archive had been in and out of tea chests. Despite attempts to catalogue the Doreen Valiente collection, certain aspects were quite disorderly. Scrabbling around for an hour, I managed to find a continuation of the note. It made no sense, but alluded to dark rites practiced during the war, as if something terrible had happened. As if someone had been killed. It's probably a piece of fiction written by Doreen, but who knows. Before I left the Centre for Pagan Studies, John Belham-Payne told me one last story regarding the Doreen Valiente collection. He said, Doreen was preparing her final days. She was very ill by then, and we both knew that soon she would be in the Summerlands. I was at her apartment in Brighton when she started to give me an energy. I felt warm, slightly prickly, and began to be highly energized. I could see it taking vitality from her, and I asked her to stop as she looked really drained. It happened again on a second occasion. This time I was passed on something permanent. I just know things. I have memories, but they are not my memories. John looked baffled. He found it difficult to tell the story as it sounded so outlandish. He continued, Doreen prepared me to go into a trance with her. She wanted me there when she died, to go into trance and guide her to the Summerlands. The energy force she gave me goes with the Book of Shadows, I suppose. When it is my time, I must pass it on to a woman. John did not need to say any more, as I recalled the words of Bill Wakefield. It wasn't knowledge he passed on, it was power. John had not known of my interviews with Bill. Besides, he already confided in his transmission of energies to a good friend some months before. I checked this to be sure, and found it to be the case. Had I stumbled across the last vestiges of Neolithic worship, where sacred energies could be transferred between beings? I was certain most of what Gardner had written was nonsense cobbled together in frustration at not being privy to the real witch cult teachings. But with the mysterious old Ernie, I could not be so sure. Had he passed the energy on to Wicca? On to Doreen? And she on to John? An energy that had to be passed man to woman, woman to man. I thought it to be too wild an idea to even be possible. I will leave the listener with the final story, told to an English Wiccan, Patricia Crowther. She was told that during the Nazi High Command meeting to discuss Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain, Hitler suddenly drifted off into sleep. It was a thing that the Führer had never done before. When he awoke, Hitler announced that he'd decided to alter his plans. The German army must prepare to invade Russia instead. His commanders listened in disbelief, as they were confident of conquering Britain. Conventional historians are at a loss to explain Hitler's unwise decision. They tell us that Hitler suddenly declared that Operation Sea Lion should continue, but only as a bluff, to open up his disastrous Eastern Front in Russia. These historians do not explain why Hitler chose to emulate the ill-fated Napoleon before him. The Führer must have known that the Russian winter had obliterated the French troops. Following Hitler's orders to clear the British Navy from the Channel to create a bluff invasion of Britain, Hermann Göring ordered the Eastern Offensive to begin. On July the 31st, Lammas Eve, unexpected bad weather delayed the entire operation for nearly 2 weeks. The rest, as they say, is history.
Thanks for joining the culture. Hope to see you again, but don't forget, hit the subscribe button. We'll see you soon. All the best.